is Geek Therapy Radio.
What are we waiting for?
And now your mental curator, Johnny Hamburger.
Welcome to this edition of Midweek Geek. If you're watching this on YouTube, the camera I'm using is just my old Nikon D3100. Just in case you're a regular viewer and you notice a difference in the image quality. For most of these, I record on my Samsung Galaxy S9. With that little note out of the way, welcome to this edition of Midweek Geek. This is the podcast-only version of Geek Therapy Radio, in which I get to talk more freeform about whatever it is I want. The actual radio broadcast is 39 minutes total of content, separated into segments of, 8 minutes, 10 minutes, 11 minutes, and 10 minutes. 4 segments. I used to be kind of more free-flowing. I wasn't on any sort of time limit, segment time limit. But that's the way the station is run now. We're on strict time limits, and that's what we got. So all that to say, welcome to Midweek Geek, where I can talk as long as I want about whatever I want, though in general this will be shorter than the main broadcast. To get to the point, this week's episode is just something that it's kind of a slow news week for geek news. We're still waiting for official benchmarks from the new RTX 2000 series of cards, and if there has been any, they haven't been groundbreaking. I think I've seen some leaks. I'm waiting to report on benchmarks until they come from verified sources. I've seen some leaks, and they kind of tend to line up with what we think the new RTX line is capable of. But until I see something more official, I'm not going to count on that. That's all to say that this is kind of a slow week for geek news. There's been some little offshoots, little kind of off the grid geek stories that have been big. And again, like I said, depending on your area of geekdom, there may have been some big breaking news. But in general, as far as big clickbaity topics, there hasn't been. So stop beating around the bush. What I wanted to talk about this week, a little idea that popped into my head a few minutes before starting this episode of Midweek Geek. Are we too old to be playing video games? And I don't mean that if you're 95 years old, is that too old to be playing video games? Because the answer is just categorically no. You can play video games from virtually any age. As soon as you're able to interact with a video screen and inputs from your motor skills, you are able to play video games. And we can go off on a side note tangent about how babies are born with screens in their faces and whether that's a good or a bad thing. I am not the professional to decide whether that's a good or bad thing. Though I'm coming to the point in my life where I'm considering, how I would raise a child, and me having grown up with video games and growing up, I'm looking at 5 computer screens right here in front of me. Right now, I'm looking at 5 screens. Our life is built around computer screens. But it still feels weird to me to see a toddler holding an iPad. I can't comment on people's different parenting styles, and I do know that there is a benefit to not having your kids screaming for a 4-hour car trip. So you put a screen in front of them and let them be entertained. But I guess I'm going to cross that bridge when I have a kid. Like how young is too young to put a screen in front of them? Does that kind of, what effect will that have on them growing up and their social skills and all that kind of stuff? If their first recollection, is that what? Their first encounter with the world is through a screen. They see people through a screen. They hear people through a screen. Interact with people through a screen. How is that going to affect their social skills when they enter school, for instance? But all of that to kind of get to my point here is that this was a similar concern when I was growing up. I'm 35 years old. Technically, I was at a bar this weekend, and technically I'm a millennial, apparently. I was born in 1983, and apparently the cutoff for millennial is 1982. I always just assume I was kind of Generation X, like really, really, really young Generation X, maybe Generation Y. It's all baffling and confusing to me. All I'm just saying is technically I'm a millennial. 35 years old, born in 1983. So we've been hearing me as a millennial, born in 1983, puts me right in that pivotal era of being brought up with video games. Some of my first memories, I will admit, are watching my brothers play video games or me play video games on the Atari 2600. And I remember I was super bummed when I was maybe 5 or 6 years old when we gave our Atari 2600 to Big Brian down the street. Big Brian was going off to college, or he joined the army or something like that. And so my parents, we just got an NES, the Nintendo NES, and we gave Big Brian our Atari 2600 to take with him when he moved away. Let's just say he moved away. And it's like, what? I like to play the Atari 2600. I didn't know it was called the Atari 2600, and maybe that's kind of a telling aspect of the story as well. I didn't know what the name of it was. I didn't know it was called Atari, let alone the exact model number, Atari 2600. I just remember playing Missile Command, and at the time I didn't know it was called Missile Command. I just remember playing a video game. But here's the difference, I think. I like to say that my generation was born right on this technological cusp where we didn't have smartphones until, we were 18 years old or so. So our formative years, yes, though we had video games, none of it was online, for me at least. I know you could connect your Commodore 64, for instance, up to the primitive internet back then. But our social interaction was not online. Our social interaction with other human beings was not through the TV screen. If we were playing two-player or multiplayer video games, that human being was sitting right beside us in the same room. It was still playing video games, even with other people, was still a very social thing to do. Furthermore, we could turn off we would get bored with the video games and want to go outside. We would get bored playing Mario and go outside in the street and play baseball or whatever. Just explore the neighborhood, explore the woods. It's a big thing right now for parents to kind of to keep a tight hold on the screen time of their children, how much time they spend playing video games or on the screen or online. I think that's a much bigger thing now to deal with for parents than it was when I was 9, 10, 12, 13 years old. Because there wasn't so much of the online stuff. It wasn't turn off the video game to do something else online in front of a screen. It wasn't turn off the video game and get on Facebook, or put down Facebook and get on the video game, or have both going at the same time. Video game was one isolated thing. It was video games and TV. And we got bored of that as children. So I don't recall my parents ever putting a stipulation on how much screen time we had. I just remember playing Mario Brothers for a couple hours, 2 or 3 hours, getting bored and going outside. Parents didn't ever have to say, turn that off and go outside. Do parents even tell their kids to go outside now? It's kind of a different world than it was in the mid-'80s. How many parents, if you're a parent, do you tell your kids to turn off the PlayStation and go outside? Your kid is 11 years old. Do you tell them to shut it off and go outside by themselves? The way that our parents did in the 80s? Is the world different? Is the world more prone to deviancy, that you're afraid of your child getting snatched up or something happening to them, versus our parents who just said, yeah, just be home when the street lights come on? We survived. Is it statistically more dangerous to let your child out now than it was in the 80s? That's kind of a separate discussion. All I'm saying is video games now are different. Maybe the addiction to video game, maybe the worry about people getting addicted to video games is different than it was It's different now than it was because, again, it's video games are different now. So what I meant by are we too old to be playing video games is our parents told us and society told us when we were sitting down playing Dig Dug and Mario and Tempest and Atari 2600 and Nintendo and Sega and all that stuff, they were telling us that we wouldn't amount to anything playing video games, that playing video games was going to make you a social outcast and you're not going to get work done, and playing too many video games was going to be a bad thing. So growing up now, 35 years old with a career, many of us have kids, many of us are making way more than I am, making 6 figures, making 7 figures, and you come home and what do? You play video games. So it hasn't caused us it hasn't had the detrimental effects that our parents and society warned us of in the mid-'80s and early 90s. Matter of fact, a lot of you people, even older than that, 60s, 60 years old, whatever, you make the video games. It's a billion-dollar industry, not $1 billion. It's billions, tens of billions, hundreds of billions of dollars industry. More than movies now. It has been for quite a while. It's a massively huge industry. It's part of GDP. It's a massive industry now. And I don't think in the primitive days of watching the blocks jump around on the screens that our parents and that society really knew that. I was reading an article about a guy who he said he's been playing Pokemon for 20 years. He's roughly my age, in his 30s, maybe a little younger, and he would play Pokemon. He always felt like he was a little bit too old to be playing Pokemon versus his little brother who was super into the animes, super into the card games, super into anything, all that stuff. He would play Pokemon Blue, the first Pokemon to come out for the Nintendo Game Boy. 96? 95? When did that come out? 98? 97? Around mid-90s. He would play it, he said, admittedly, illegally on an emulator on his 133 megahertz computer way back then. He would play in his bedroom with the door closed, as if he was ashamed of it. And now 20 years later, he is there at launch for every new Pokemon title. And he was wondering, is he too old to be playing these video games? And the answer was no. And that's what got me thinking about this. But I'm thinking about it in a different way. Was there a time when you became an adult, like our parents and society were hinting at and were urging us, there's a time when you become an adult, you put down the video games and you get a real job and get a real life and everything? That hasn't happened, and that hasn't been a detriment to society. I know a lot of people listening to that just heard a trigger. Well, we've had a lot more mass shootings now, and video games are to blame for the mass shootings. No, it isn't. That is so incredibly naive. If anything, and I don't want to make too big of a blanket statement here, you know what? There's two facts. This is just my opinion. Here's my opinion now. Johnny Hamburger opinion on the rise of mass shootings. And no, I didn't think that this is where this Midweek Geek was going to go, but that's the beauty of Midweek Geek, is that it can go anywhere. My opinion, sole opinion on mass shootings and the rise of mass shootings. The first mass shooting, popularly the first mass shooting occurred at Columbine in 1999. What else happened in the late 90s? High-speed internet and people's access to everybody. The world got very small in 1999 with the rise of high-speed internet, and your fame for doing something heinous rose exponentially. Instant Messenger was a thing. Social media was just in the beginnings of becoming a thing. So I think that, coupled with, let's just say it, possibly a lack of parenting, is what led to the rise of mass shootings. These kids they know that they're going to be famous now for it instantly. And they don't care that it's a bad fame. They don't care if they are criminals, if they go down as cowards, if they go down as societal trash. It doesn't matter. They're famous now, and they inflicted a lot of pain on the people they felt hurt them, or on the society they felt hurt them. It wasn't video games. It was the appeal of instant stardom and lack of parenting. That's just my opinion, and that's probably not too far off. There's probably studies that allude to such. And again, just opinion. Just my opinion. But back to the point here to close out Geek Therapy Radio, or Midweek Geek this week. I don't think playing video games growing up for my generation has been detrimental. Elon Musk grew up playing video games. He's going to get us to Mars. He has SpaceX and Tesla and the Boring Company and all that stuff. He grew up coding and making games for his Commodore 64. Playing video games has got us that much closer to interplanetary travel. So, all I'm saying is, for my generation, playing video games has not been a detriment. Arguably, it's been a plus. And if you want to blame video games on society's ills, look to the parents first, look to society first. It's not the games. Because you know what? Just like when Bart Simpson would cuss when watching The Simpsons, Bart would say hell and my mom would say, don't say hell. It was easy as that. We could watch almost whatever we want within reason. And my parents would just say, that's wrong. Don't do that. It was called parenting. I'm not saying that you parents are bad parents at all. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying there's a bunch of factors that are at play here. Thank you for watching Geek Therapy Radio, Midweek Geek this week. Be good to each other. The best way we can be good to each other is by being good to ourselves. Engage in a hobby this week. Find a new hobby, engage in an old one. Just take care of yourselves. Play with a Lego set, something like that. I always say that. Just be good to each other and be good to yourselves. And I'll see you next week for more Midweek Geek, and I'll see you this weekend for Geek Therapy Radio. Take care, everybody.